Love is selfish. It seeks only to serve its interests and no one else's. It does not care for old promises. It does not respect the boundaries drawn by culture. It only cares for its flame, and that its flame continues to burn. Hi there, Paul. A long time ago in a faraway land, a young woman, Mafara, fell in love with a fisherman, not knowing that an oath had been undertaken by her family that she would be the sacrifice of a centuries-old curse that had made it difficult for anyone in her family to live past the age of 30, and therefore she would never marry. Mafara had been born in a wealthy family, with her father's family owning herds of cattle so vast that they had been granted permission by the kingdom to expand their crows into the forest, for the kingdom's land could no longer sustain the livestock. Their reserves in gold were so vast that no matter how many bars they paid to the king in tributes, the gold did not dwindle. And their crops were always healthy, and even in times of drought, they thrived and glowed healthily as other people's crops died. But this wealth had come at a cost for the family. For many decades prior, an ancestor, tired of the poverty that had reduced the family to a laughingstock in the kingdom, tired of rummaging through firesides for a fallen morsel at night, had decided to visit a nganga in another kingdom. The seer was renowned for charms that changed fortunes and lives, and he had a waiting list that was a year long. And so when finally Mafara's ancestors' turn had come, the seer had looked at the bones she had scattered to the ground. Then pointing at them with a turkey's feather, he had told the ancestor that there was indeed great wealth awaiting the family. But there was a condition. Bring a black hen, the seer had told the ancestor, a black hen and a bag of grain. And when the ancestor had brought this, the nganga had led him out into the courtyard, then instructed him to fill both his hands with as much grain as they could hold. When he had done so, the seer who held the black hen between her palms then said, I will ask you to scatter the grains onto the ground. Then I will place this hen onto the ground. The number of grains the hen will peck and eat will be the number of reigns you and your sons and their sons and their sons will live. But in those years, none of them, or their wives, or their children, or their servants will grow hungry. Instead, their pens will overflow, and their sheds will spill, and no one will go to bed hungry ever. Understood? The ancestor, whose stomach was growling with hunger, nodded and said, I understand. Then throw, the seer said, and the two watched as the grain momentarily rose, then succumbed to the pressure of gravity and spiraled all to the ground. Then tentatively, the seer placed the hen onto the ground, and the two watched as it strutted on its tippy toes, then shaking its feathers, then bowing to the ground to eat. And they counted the grains, 30 in all, before the hen shook its feathers again and wandered off to an unknown errand in the yard. And the seer had given the ancestor one big maize seed, instructing him to plant it in the middle of his homestead and telling him to start preparing for the planting season, even though it was still winter, as poverty and hunger would no longer be a part of his life. And true to the seer's words, once the ancestor had returned home and planted the maize seed, a visitor had passed by their home that night, asking for a place to sleep as he could not continue his journey to another kingdom at night. And in the morning, he had thanked the family with a gold bar for their hospitality and continued on his way. In the ensuing months, the profits from the bar had sustained the family, and they had never hungered after that. By the time the rains came and the harvests were reaped, the family had purchased a cow and a goat, and with the excess from the harvest, purchased more livestock, and in the following years, more and more, that the pens and crows soon filled up. And also, true to the seer's words, the year the ancestor turned 30, On one calm winter afternoon, as he checked the kettle in his pans, a lone cloud had appeared in the sky, and then shortly after, another had also popped up, and the two had rushed gladly towards each other, and as they collided, a spark had rent the air, striking the ancestor to the ground, and the bang that followed had preceded his last exhale. And so, for generations to come, children would be born to immense wealth with access to gifts and ceremonies that were only availed for royalty. And because of this wealth, they inadvertently became somewhat decision makers in the kingdom, sometimes even overtly overriding the decisions made by the king, who himself had no power to override them, for their wealth helped too to prop the kingdom up. But in spite of the wealth, their days of expiration were written in the skies, and as inevitable as the rooster's cry at dawn, at 30 rains, the sons and daughters all drooped, never to breathe again. And what was worse was how they expired. One was bitten by a poisonous snake in the morning, and an antidote was quickly brought, and he was revived, only to be bitten by a harmless house snake in the evening and succumbing to it. Another playfully leapt over a tiny log in the path before him, and he slipped and fell, never to rise again. Another choked on a vegetable strip, and he passed, trying to drag the strip that hung from his mouth out. Another complained of a fart that refused to come out until at last it took him, and another had scratched the pimple of a mosquito bite, then it bled and bled and bled until he passed, none of them a day over 31 rains. So the family sought help from soothsayers and seers and charlatans, while some looted and scammed their never-ending resources with promises of, "It's over, it won't happen again." For the most part, they had been told, "You disturbed society's order by becoming rich. Your family was meant to be poor, and thus the price to pay is death." When they had asked, "What should we do to remove this curse?" they had been told, "Get rid of the wealth." Yet none of them could. The gold was too exhilarating to have, the cows too powerful a currency to possess. It was Mafara's father, however, who had visited another seer and had been told that a sacrifice was needed. "What kind of sacrifice?" he asked. "A maiden," the seer said, "a maiden who has never known a man, and whose heart shall never pine for a man's love, and who shall never marry." "I know of no maiden in the family," Mafara's father, who was 29 reigns at that time, and who knew that his days were clocking closer, said. The seer had simply shrugged and shown him the door. But the father had returned after a moon, and through his aching heart had said, "Does the sacrifice work if the maiden is only 4 reigns old?" The seer had nodded and said, "As long as she shall never know a man all her life." And unknowing, 4 reigns old Mafara, in her heart, bouncing the golden marbles her father had made for her, had been bound. Now Mafara was a 20 reigns beauty, whose charm had everyone who met her in a spell. Everywhere she walked, admirers turned to look at her, the girls and women all wanting to be just like her, the young men all wanting to be with her. With the girls and women, she stopped to chat, exchanging a few pleasantries, a tasteful well-placed joke, and a soft giggle that twinkled through the afternoon before she moved on. To the young man who looked at her for seconds longer than necessary, however, she threw a disdainful sneer their way and walked on. And though many a young man had drawn closer, wanting to look at her closely or just to talk to her, they had failed to penetrate the wall of guards who always surrounded her to keep them at bay. And too, many had visited their father's homestead, asking for her hand in marriage, demonstrating they had the wealth to take care of her as your father had done, showing off uncommon skills such as juggling pails of water in the air, or whistling through their ears, or walking with only one hand, but your father had chased them all away. And even though it hurt him that his only beloved daughter, the child on whom he looked at and his heart would brim with unexplainable love, would never know the warmth of a man, he was grateful that he had been the first in his family to see his children grow, and that no horrific expiries had occurred thereafter. One afternoon, however, Mafara sneaked out, just as she always did. She told her guards that she would be taking a nap for the rest of the afternoon, and she did not want to be disturbed. She stood by the window of her hut for a while, watching the guards settle down by her door. Then, satisfied she would not be disturbed, stealthily walked to the back of the hut, where a hidden door had been skillfully hidden under thatch. She had discovered it as a teenager, and somehow the door had opened her up to a portal of unadulterated freedom. For from there, she only had to cross a lone cluster of trees. Then she would find herself in a secluded spot by the riverside. And on the afternoons she craved solitude, she slipped to a spot where she would remove her heavy robes and jewelry, frolic by the water, and once tired, go to lay by the soft riverbank sand. Which is what she did that random afternoon she met him. She had done her frolicking and had gone to sleep by the river bank as usual, but then she had been awoken by a big wet splatter on her forehead and the rumble of rain in the skies. She sprang up and looked into the skies. A downpour was almost upon her. So she ran to the boulder where she had left her robes, and quickly, amid the now heavy drops, draped over her dress. She was about to run off when she remembered she had been wearing the prized golden necklace with the exquisite blue gemstone that her father had given her. So she was told to look for it. Only it was not there, although she could swear she had left it right by the boulder. She was not aware, though, that the rains had started up north, and now the river had swollen and was bringing with it torrents. So the moment she spotted the gemstone lying in the clear water by the bank and stepped forward to pick it, the torrent too was sweeping by her feet and sweeping her off the feet. Panicked, Mafara only had time to grab the boulder on which her robes had lain and hugged it to her bosom as the torrents ravaged her lower body. She held on for the longest time, refusing to let go, yet hoping the torrents, would ease up soon. But the rain was quickly becoming a deluge, and the flow of water was increasingly quicker, threatening to pull her lower limbs downstream with it. And she started to tire, her arms painful from straining too hard, her legs in pain from the battering of fast waters. She tried to silence the voice in her head that told her to let go, but it was increasingly becoming insistent. So finally, as the pain in her arms and armpits became unbearable, she said her prayers and took one last sigh and removed one arm, then the other, then surrendered to the power of the water. Except she felt something pulling her, dragging her dead weight out of the water. Then she was brought to the outskirts of the river that had not been swallowed up by the waters, and then pulled to her feet, then lifted into the air until she was in some shelter away from the rain outside. It took a while for her eyes to become accustomed to the dimness of the shelter, and when they finally did, she could tell it was a ramshackle hut, and before her a young man stood, looking at her, concern in his handsome eyes. Then, when he had seen she had become aware of her surroundings, the young man Onai, voice stern, asked, "What were you doing in the water during a downpour? Do you have a death wish?" But Mafara had no response to that, so all she said was a weak thank you, before her teeth began to grind and gnash from both fear and cold. "It's okay," he said, as he led her to a fire by the corner of the hut, and there he handed her a towel and poured her a cup of warm milk. It was a while before Mafara felt better. She stood and went to peep outside. It was still raining, but she was glad it was still day. She would have to return home before she was found to be missing. She turned to the young man who looked at her intently and she said, "Thank you for saving my life. If you had not been there, I would probably be gone by now." Then she reached for her throat, where the blue gemstone necklace lay, and she unclasped it before extending it towards him. "Take this. It is a gesture to thank you for your kindness." But Onai quickly recoiled. Never in his life had he seen so much wealth in one small item. He knew he could never touch that. "You don't have to thank me with an expensive trinket, ma'am. Besides, I only did what any other person would have done. We just thank the Mecca that you are alive and well. Now, let's get you home before it gets too dark." And grabbing her hand, he led her out of the hut, and they ran through the rain back to her home behind the cluster of trees. Onai let go of her hand, watched her run into her homestead, and sighed before turning to go back to his hut. As he walked, he did not feel the large drops of rain that pummeled him, nor the claps of thunder in the sky. All he could think of was her. The young woman he had seen for years come to frolic in the waters, thinking she was all alone. When he had first seen her from his hidden fisherman cottage in the trees, he had been a teenage boy and he had developed a massive crush on her. But as the years had blurred into one another, he had fallen for her, blinded by an unrequited love towards a stranger who did not even know he existed. Many a times he had tried to walk towards her, to strike a conversation with her, but fear had held him back. He had heard of your reputation of putting all young men in their place, so what hope did he, a foreigner, a fisherman, have with her? So he had been shocked when he had canoed over to the shore to find her hugging a boulder while in a flood, and instinct had driven him to serve her. And for the first time ever, he had gotten closer to her, felt her energies around him, held her hand, looked into the deep pools that were her eyes, and he knew he wanted to be with her, yet knew too that he would probably never see her again because she had learned that there was a presence in your safe space, in your area of solitude, and she would probably never return again. Yet to Onai's surprise, she returned the following day. He had just woken up after spending the night fishing the now calm river, and after going to deliver his wares in the market in the morning, when he stood by the door to his hut and saw her coming towards him. He rushed to make the hut look decent, then strolled to the door, feigning a casualness he did not feel, and found her already standing there. "Well," he said, still feigning surprise. "Hi, what brings you here?" Mafara looked at him, trying to bring up the feelings of disdain she had always felt for young men in the kingdom, yet failing. She had come back to prove to herself that the feelings that had kept her awake in the night had been nothing but gratitude, that her heart had not steered closer to closer to affection for this random stranger. But now, seeing him in the broad light of the day, away from the tempest of the previous afternoon, she felt her heart shift, and a desire to be close to him always seized her. "I," she said, reaching into the pockets of her dress and taking out a simple golden chain. "I brought you this just to say thank you again." When she saw him opening his mouth to protest, she said quickly, "Please, what you did for me yesterday is worth more than 1,000 of these." But still he shook his head and said, "I can't accept that, but since you are insistent on thanking me, you can spend the afternoon with me. I do get rather lonely here on my own." Mafara shrugged, shoving the chain inside her pocket, trying to calm her giddy heart, and refusing to listen to the mind that was telling her to flee, telling her it was dangerous here. She followed him when he said, "Come, let's go to a place you have never been to," and allowed him to help her into the canoe where he followed and began paddling across the wide river to the other side. And when they disembarked, he led her up a small hill, and when they reached the top, he pointed at the valley below where a lush kingdom basked in the afternoon sun. "My home," he told her, and she looked, smiling at its resplendency. She learnt that afternoon that his name was Onai, and that he had been taught by his father to fish, and had built a name for himself by supplying both his kingdom and a kingdom with the sacred meat. Mafara looked at him as he spoke, listening to the soft cadence of his voice, and for the first time in her life, she felt safe. And she was sad when later in the afternoon he told her that they had to return. Onai accompanied her right to the edge of the cluster of the trees that hid her home, and after saying their lingering goodbyes, he asked, "Will I see you again?" Hadi, Mafara nodded and returned the next day, and the next, and the next, and the next, an incredible pull driving her towards him. And always Onai would be waiting for her, and the two would paddle wherever the oar took them, their laughter trailing across the waves, their joy floating in the air. And these unadulterated afternoons wove unseen magic between the two of them, drawing them closer, not just emotionally, but physically too, as each day they closed the gap between them as they sat, until not even a single strand of air could pass through them. And bit by bit too, their fingers brushed against each other until they began to crave each other's company, then became inseparable, and Onai would use only one paddle to move the canoe. Until one afternoon, after their canoe ride, Onai had accompanied her home, and as they stood by the edges of the cluster of trees, he had looked solemnly into her eyes and said, "I love you, Mafara. Please be mine." It was on the tip of Mafara's tongue to say, "I love you too," but she remembered everything, and she unclasped her hand from his and fled. Back in her heart, she remembered the conversations she had had with her parents after her rites of passage ceremony. "Do not ever talk to a boy," her mother had said. "They do not mean any good. They will use you and ravage you because you come from a good, wealthy family, and then they will leave you to marry another. This, your father's home, is the best place to be." And this message had been drummed into her head more and more as she grew older, and with greater vigorosity from her father. "I will disown you if you ever smile at a young man," her father would say, "and I will only disown you after I have taken out the young man." And because Mafara had never found a young man she liked before, she had always laughed and said, "You don't have to worry about me, Baba. I intend to obey you forever." But that had been before Onai. Then Onai had come and restructured her heart and her mind, and she wanted to feel those feelings that bubbled in her heart for him. Yet she knew that their love was forbidden, and she feared that if Baba found out about him, he would probably die. She knew that whatever tryst she had had with Onai had to end. The dalliance was over, and she promised herself she would never return to the river again. For a moon, she did not, staying in her heart at all times, refusing to eat, to interact with anyone, lying that she was sick with a stomach ailment. Her father brought herb doctors, and she pretended to swallow their herbs and potions, and when they were gone, retreated again into the doldrums. Until despairing, her father had brought his trusted Nganga, the seer who had saved the family from expiration at 30 reigns old. "I do not know what is wrong with her," Mafara had heard her father tell the seer as they stepped into her hut. "Please save my only daughter." But the seer had taken one look at Mafara, and their eyes had widened so high that Mafara was scared they would scratch her hairline. She is in love, the seer said, or the curse will return, or you will lose all you have. Your daughter has fallen. Mafara saw your father's gaze widen too as he looked at her and as he whispered, How? Where? She's always here. How could she be in love? But the seer was shaking her head. Yes, she is in love. My visions are always accurate. She turned to Mafara's father. It will be up to you to choose one. Either sacrifice your wealth or sacrifice your life, because if she continues on this path, you might lose both. Then the seer had leaned out on a walking cane. Who is he? Baba shouted at Mafara and she cowered. Not once had she ever seen him in such a state of rage. Who is he so that I shake the life out of him? Baba, Mafara said, in the voice she knew always calmed him. It is true. There is someone I love. But before I show him to you, what is this about a curse? Mafara listened in growing horror as your father explained their past. Only you can save us, your father finished, almost pleading. Please, my child, do it for your family. Show him to us, and we will deal with him quietly. I will even give you half of my crows so you become the only woman of means in this kingdom. Please, child. Mafara knew that if she denied her father, then he would remain in her heart. Yet she needed time to think. So she nodded and said, It's okay, Baba. I understand. I will take you to him tomorrow. He nodded and whispered, Thank you, my child. Then left, and once outside, Mafara could hear him calling for more reinforcement around her heart from the guards. Alone, Mafara closed her eyes, and every single thing about Onai's essence came rushing back to her. His handsome face, the sinew in his muscles, the wild hair that added to his allure, the scent of fresh water, the kind eyes, the gentle laughter. She thought of how your father intended to snuff all that away, and she thought of a lifetime without him. It was unfathomable. She wanted no part in that existence. Why did she have to pay for a sin she had not committed, while her brothers had their best lives? Why did she have to be the sacrifice? No, she thought to herself as she sprang to her feet and began to stuff her pockets with as many trinkets as possible. She was choosing herself now. She had already given them the extra lives they had had. Now she was reclaiming hers. And out of her heart, through the hidden exit, she slipped into the dusk. She ran to the river like a demented peasant chasing the wind. It was dusk, and she knew he set out to his fishing escapades around this time. She had to find him before it was too late. And when she got there, it was to find his canoe bobbing up and down the gentle waves as it transported him to his work. She called out, Onai! Hoping her voice would ricochet across the gentle rush of the river, and for a moment he continued on his way. But she called out again and again and again, then saw the canoe freeze in the water, then change direction towards her. Onai did not wait for the canoe to park safely, but quickly jumped out and waded towards her. And as she rushed into his already outstretched arms, he heard her say into his chest, I love you too, Onai, and I want to be with you forever. But please take me away, far from here. It is dangerous for us here. He heard the frenetic edging in her voice and squeezed her harder before leading her to his canoe and pedaling her to the other side of the shore to his home. 3 months later, Mafara gingerly stepped out of Onai's canoe as they parked by his old hut. She allowed him to lead her, leaning on his strength as her legs were too shaky to move. And eventually they arrived at her home, no longer the majestic throne it had been, but a ramshackle homestead that seemed to have been battered by every horrific element in the world. and even the majestic tree that had towered over the homestead had withered and died. But then Mafara saw them, her parents, sitting by a fire and a small pot over it. Amai, Baba, she said quietly, and they both jerked their heads towards her, and when they saw her, stood and rushed to embrace her. Oh, child, her mother cried, taking her daughter's face in her palms. I am so glad you are alive. And then your mother turned to Onai and shook his hand, saying, Welcome, Kwasha. And as they sat by the fire, your father told her, When we realized you had gone, we were so devastated. But what made us even sadder was that despite the strength of the love you had, you would not live past 30 rain. So we called the seer and asked for a cleansing so that the curse would be broken and the wealth would go, but that you would at least have a good love and a long life like we had. Mafara smiled and said, Thank you. Then she told them, But all is not lost. She smiled at Onai. Onai here would like to start negotiations for my Roora. Onai nodded and added, I did not feel right about living with someone's daughter without the necessary traditional rites. I am so glad you are still here so that we can begin the negotiations. Mafara's parents nodded and said, Thank you, Mukwasha. We appreciate that. Later that night, after everyone had retired for bed, Mafara and Onai drew closer to each other by the fireside, and Mafara looked into her husband to be's eyes and said, Thank you for everything. I love you. And I love you even more, he said. The end. Thank you for watching the story to the end, and I hope you enjoyed listening to it as much as I enjoyed writing it. There are also many other African romance stories you can immerse yourself in here, and all you need to do is click the playlist above or browse the channel. Also, if you can, please do leave a like or a comment or a subscription, and you can also share with your friends and family. For the meantime, goodbye and lots of love.